He came back to himself in sequence, the way a building is inventoried after a fire. Ceiling first, then light, then smell, then the body. The ceiling was dressed stone, low and functional, its blocks fitted with the economical precision of people who had been thinking about keeping weather out rather than keeping appearances up. No plaster, no paint. No gilded molding suggesting that the room's occupant mattered enough to obscure the construction. He had slept in rooms like this before. Posting stations, secure facilities, embassy annexes that were annexes because no one had wanted to pay for the main building. Rooms built to serve a purpose rather than communicate one. Wrong ceiling. He had not slept in a room like this recently, and recently was the operative word because his sense of recent was apparently no longer reliable. The light came through a narrow window facing north. Blue-gray, early morning, a cold climate's version of dawn. Not the south-facing warmth he had been waking up to for. He ran the count and stopped himself. That life had a different ceiling. He filed the window under orientation and kept going. The smell, wood smoke, tallow, and something astringent underneath both, the burnt resinous undertone of a compound he associated with sick rooms. Someone had been burning medicinal herbs in here, or whatever passed for medicinal herbs in a world that did not have the benefit of 3 centuries of accumulated pharmacological embarrassment. He noted the smell and drew the obvious conclusion: the body. He had been hoping in the fraction of a second between registering the ceiling and registering everything else that the body might be his. It was not. It was young. Very young. 16 or 17 at a guess. And the guess was somewhat academic since it was his body only in the most technical sense of being the one he was currently occupying. It was also genuinely ill. The particular exhaustion of a high fever recently broken was something he recognized from the wrong side. He had sat with it often enough in other people to know what it felt like, and the experience of being inside it rather than beside it was not improved by familiarity. The fatigue was bone deep and entirely unglamorous. No amount of professional discipline would argue its way past it. He tried to sit up. He could not. He lay still instead and began to listen. This was not a defeat. Lying still and listening was frequently the most productive available option, and he had learned to treat it as such. The attendant came through an inner door fast enough that she must have been sleeping lightly, or not sleeping at all. She was young, younger than the body he was in, which was saying something. With the particular combination of alarm and efficiency that he associated with people who had been managing a crisis long enough to develop systems for it. She did not look at him. She went directly to the corridor door and called through it for the physician in a voice calibrated to carry without waking the whole wing. Then she turned and saw that his eyes were open. Her face did something complicated. Relief was the largest part of it. He watched her process the relief with more precision than the situation probably warranted, and filed what he saw. She had been scared for him, not of him. The distinction mattered. Fear of a person was social information. Fear for a person was a different category entirely, and rarer, and considerably harder to manufacture. He performed unconsciousness. It was not a difficult performance. He had done it in worse conditions, and the body was genuinely close enough to unconscious that the margin of acting required was minimal. He kept his eyes at 3/4 closed, his breathing slow and slightly rough, and waited. The physician arrived within a few minutes. He was a compact man somewhere in his 50s, unhurried in the way of people who have trained themselves out of visible urgency, because visible urgency in a physician is its own form of patient information, and not always helpful information. He examined the patient with brisk, impersonal thoroughness, touching the forehead and wrist and neck with the same practice sequence each time, and he spoke to the attendant in the register of someone who had long since stopped wondering whether the patient could hear. Julien received his first briefing in this world from a physician who thought he was asleep. The fever had broken 2 days ago, the physician said. Full recovery expected within the week, barring complications, of which he anticipated none. The king had been informed this morning and was relieved. Prince Roderick and Prince Aldous had not come to inquire. This last piece of information was delivered without emphasis, slotted between the fever timeline and the dietary instructions as though it were of equivalent significance. The physician did not consider it notable. Of course he didn't. A physician whose job was to report on the third prince's health had no particular professional stake in the social geometry of royal brothers. It was data, not data about anything. Julian filed it in the column labeled Family Dynamics with the notation, significant. Revisit when context is established. The physician left. The attendant, Marta, he would learn her name by the second day, and he made a note to ask it, sat in the chair beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at nothing in particular with the weary relief of someone who had kept a long watch and was not quite ready to admit that it was over. She had been genuinely frightened. He could see the specific quality of it in the way she was sitting, braced, still managing, not yet certain she could stop. He found this disproportionately affecting for reasons he chose not to analyze immediately. He filed it under a column that did not yet have a label and lay still until she fell into a doze. His prior life was intact. This was what he had been most uncertain about, in the way that a man falling through ice is most uncertain about whether he will be able to breathe when he surfaces, and it was, he found, the right thing to have been uncertain about. Everything else was secondary to that. The specific feel of a briefing document read under fluorescent light at 3 in the morning. The quality of silence in an embassy annex the hour before a meeting that was going to go badly. The faces of colleagues whose surnames he could produce without effort, some of whom had probably been alive until recently, and some of whom certainly weren't. None of whom were here. He had them. 20-plus years of career, intact and indexed. The accumulated professional reflexes, still operational. The tradecraft, not theory, not summary, but the muscle memory of how networks actually work, how people actually behave under operational stress, how information actually moves and where it stops. Available in a form he could use immediately if the body he was using had been capable of immediate use, which it was not. What he also had, somewhat less usefully, were the boy's memories. They were present the way a file is present when someone else has written it. Complete in the factual sense, entirely uninhabited from the inside. He read them the way he had once read background files on contacts he needed to understand quickly. With attention, without investment, alert for the gaps between what was recorded and what must have been felt. A cold childhood without being a cruel one. The distinction was there if you looked for it. The difference between a household that was indifferent to warmth and one that was actively opposed to it. A mother who had died early enough that her absence was more fully present than she was. A shape in the negative space where something ought to have been. Two brothers who occupied every room they entered as though rooms were a finite resource to be claimed before someone else did. A father managing his own mortality with the focused attention of a man who had decided that management was all that remained. None of it felt like his history. That was both a relief and a specific category of discomfort he was not going to resolve in the next few days, and he noted it and set it aside. The discomfort was real. It was also not the most pressing item. He cataloged what he had and what he didn't, with the systematic dispatch of someone writing an end-of-posting report that no one was going to read but himself. What he had: one body, young, convalescent, and already in possession of a reputation for harmlessness that the original occupant had apparently built through genuine disinterest rather than performance. This was a better starting position than if the prince had been known as ambitious or politically attentive. He did not have to construct the cover. He had to not contradict it, which was an entirely different and considerably easier task. A royal title with no meaningful power attached, third son, the succession position that existed primarily to fill a chair at the formal table. A fortress capital called Stonewatch that was, from the narrow evidence of the window, built by someone who had understood that a position in high terrain was worth more than most other military assets. Time, the one resource that no one who had already written off the subject bothered to guard. What he didn't have: money, influence, physical strength, in the immediate term. Any network, verified allies, or human assets of any description. A clear sense of the political calendar. He could feel the shape of the crises coming, the general direction of the pressures, but not when they would arrive or at what specific angle. The current posture of either empire. Anything at all that had happened in this world in the preceding century, in any form more reliable than broad generalization. What he could do, nothing overt, everything covert. The logic of how networks were built had not changed in this century or any other, because it was not a logic that depended on specific technology or specific institutional arrangements. It depended on human beings continuing to need things, fear things, and owe things. Those three fulcra had been sufficient for every network he had built in his previous life. He could not immediately identify a reason they would fail to be sufficient here. He turned this assessment over once, found nothing to add, and filed it under initial conditions. Then he went back to sleep, because the body required it regardless of what the person inside it preferred, and because sleep was the only thing he could do right now that also served the cover perfectly. The first day passed mostly in this fashion. He slept, woke, assessed, slept again. Marta brought broth at intervals and watched him drink it with the professionally neutral expression of someone monitoring an important process. He drank the broth without complaint, which he gathered was different from the boy's usual behavior during illness. She seemed slightly surprised by it. He noted this. The original Julien had apparently been a difficult patient. This was useful information. It told him that mild, cooperative, slightly distracted behavior would read as a symptom of recovery rather than as an out-of-character personality shift. On the second day, he asked her name. She told him, and then paused for a half-beat, caught off guard, he thought, by being asked, as though the question were unexpected. He stored this alongside the loyal without being bought notation and did not comment on it. The physician came again on the second morning and delivered his assessment to the patient directly this time, in the adjusted register of someone who had been informed the patient was now conscious. Julien received the medical report with mild interest and a question about whether the particular herb compound he'd smelled was still in use or whether the fever had resolved it. The physician blinked, confirmed that the fever had indeed resolved the need for the compound, and appeared to revise something in his assessment. Julien let him. Whatever he was revising toward, it would not be this prince is an experienced intelligence officer using my professional habits as a collection opportunity, which was the only revision that mattered. He asked no further questions. He had what he needed, and there was no particular value in teaching the physician to be careful around him. On the third day, he decided to get up. Not because he was ready. The body would not be ready for another week, at a conservative estimate. The bone-deep fatigue of a serious fever was not something that resolved on a schedule chosen by the person experiencing it. He got up because remaining in bed past a certain point began to suggest incapacity rather than convalescence. And incapacity was a different kind of weakness than the one he intended to project. Eccentric convalescent was useful. Actually, unable to function was a limitation. He called for Marta and allowed her to help him dress, which was useful in several small ways that he did not enumerate aloud. It let him assess the range of motion available in the body. It gave him a baseline for what normal care in this household looked like, which told him something about resources, and Marta's specific manner of helping him, competent, practiced, not intrusive, told him she had done this often enough to have developed a system which confirmed that the prince's illness was not recent or unusual, but a recurring feature of his life that the household had learned to manage. Chronic health issue, he noted, not acute. This meant the cover of fragility was structurally supported. It also meant the body he was using had been building toward this kind of crisis for some time before he arrived in it, which was information he set aside in the not immediately useful column. He declined dinner in favor of the library. Marta's expression shifted as he said it, softening from professional care into something warmer and more personal. "That's a Prince Julien answer," was what her face said. Good. The cover was operational without his involvement. He simply had to continue being it. The walk from the bedchamber to the library was not long. It was long enough. He moved slowly, which was not performance. The body required slow movement and rewarded any attempt to rush it with a specific and humbling lightheadedness that he had already cataloged under constraints, physical, temporary. Within this slow movement, however, he did the first piece of actual work he had done since waking in this world. He memorized Stonewatch. The technique was not complicated. You moved through a space and you noted what mattered: guard positions, patrol rhythm, sight lines, structural features, while appearing to be doing something else entirely. In his prior life, the something else had often been reviewing documents or having a conversation. Here he had available the significant advantage of a cover identity that explained stopping in corridors to look at wall fixtures with an expression of mild perplexity. The eccentric prince noticed things that no one else considered worth noticing. This was, under the current circumstances, a professional asset of the First Order. He stopped twice, once to examine an iron bracket mounted at shoulder height on the south corridor wall, a fixture that told him the corridor had once been a regular patrol route, given the placement and the wear pattern, and that the patrol had been discontinued at some point because no guard was currently positioned at the junction it implied. The gap in the patrol rhythm went into the file, once to look out a corridor window at the inner courtyard, which gave him the sight lines from the eastern wing to the postern gate and the approximate distance between them, which he measured in footsteps he was not yet fully coordinating. By the time he reached the library, he had the castle's interior geometry stored to a working approximation. Not precise, sufficient. The library was a long room with two windows, both north-facing, and shelves that held perhaps 40 or 50 volumes. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, taking the room's measure. The books were informative in a specific way that had nothing to do with their contents. The spines on the agricultural records were worn smooth with handling. The legal histories were similarly used. The volumes that dealt with what he recognized as philosophy and rhetoric were pristine, their spines unbroken. The kind of pristine that meant they had never been regularly opened, rather than the kind that meant they were carefully preserved. This was a court that read what it needed and left the rest to look decorative, which meant it was either pragmatic or underfunded or both. And the room itself argued for both. He did not find this disappointing. He found it useful. A court that valued operational knowledge over cultural display was a court with specific, identifiable priorities, and identifiable priorities were levers. He would know what they were once he knew the people who had made these choices. He would know the people once he was mobile enough to meet them. He selected a volume that appeared to be a survey of the mountain passes. Its spine was third most worn in the collection, which placed it behind agriculture and just ahead of military logistics, and settled into the chair nearest the north window. He opened the book. He did not read it. What he did was sit in the specific stillness of someone who has spent enough time in rooms where being observed required looking occupied to have made looking occupied into a posture rather than a performance. The book was open. His eyes moved at appropriate intervals. His mind was elsewhere, running the assessment he had been building for 3 days through what he now knew about the physical structure of Stonewatch, cross-referencing the family dynamics notation against the patrol gap, considering whether the physician's discretion was professional habit or something more deliberately cultivated, beginning the first version of a list that would, if he was right about what the pass through the mountains represented, eventually become the most consequential document he had written in either of his lives. He sat until the evening bell rang in the lower courtyard, and the light through the north window went the particular gray-blue that this latitude produced in the last hour before dark. Then he closed the book and placed it on the shelf in a slightly different position from where he had found it. Not a rearrangement, a shift of perhaps 2 fingers' width, and stood. The window faced north. He had known in the abstract way that the boy's memories provided general orientation, that Stonewatch stood at the foot of the Frostspine Range. He had not yet seen the mountains. They were enormous. He stood at the library window for a moment that he did not budget and was not entirely certain how to categorize. The Frostspine at dusk was violet and iron gray, and indifferent to everything happening at its feet, with the particular indifference of things that had been large for a very long time and had stopped paying attention to comparisons. He had worked his entire previous life in meeting rooms, in embassy corridors, and the specific geography of cities built to impress other cities. He had operated, in the main, in places built by and for human beings. He had never operated anywhere that the landscape itself was the primary strategic asset. He did not know yet that the mountains were his entire strategy. That particular understanding was a few weeks away, requiring the approach to Wingate Pass in daylight and the specific clarity of watching a problem resolve itself into a plan. Right now, what he knew was that he was in a body he didn't own, in a century he hadn't been born into, in a kingdom that had been written off by both its neighbors as a non-entity, looking at a mountain range that someone had built a fortress specifically to sit beside. Someone several centuries ago had understood something. He intended to find out what. He thought, bigger than I expected. Good. He went to dinner, carrying his survey of the mountain passes under one arm, and remembered to walk slowly. The Great Hall of Stonewatch was dressed stone and old banners, and it was genuinely imposing. Not in the way of places designed to impose, but in the way of places that have simply never been replaced. The banners were dark with age, their original colors surviving only in the embroidered centers where the fabric had been protected from light and smoke. The stone had taken on the specific gray of walls that have absorbed decades of tallow smoke and cook fire, and the breath of people arguing about money in close quarters. There was no gilding. There were no columns. There was a long table, a fireplace that worked because it had been designed by people who understood draft rather than aesthetics, and 8 chairs that did not quite fill the table's length. He noted the chairs before he sat down. The table seated 8. It had always seated 8, or rather, it had been built to seat more, and the chairs currently at it represented the council as it stood now, which was to say, as it had stood for at least a generation, without addition or subtraction. No new appointments. No expansions. The Council of Oakhaven had not grown since the table was set. He filed this under institutional inertia, significant, and found his seat in the corner assigned to the third prince, a position that communicated, with the quiet efficiency of architectural precedent, that his presence was optional. He settled into it and prepared to be invisible, which was the one skill at which he had always been reliably underestimated. King Edrin was older than the boy's memories had suggested, not dramatically older, not the shocking revision of a man aging poorly or a memory deeply wrong. Something subtler. The memories had preserved a version of the king that was still managing from strength, still working from resources not yet fully drawn down. What sat at the head of the table was the same man after 10 additional years of doing the same thing with decreasing margin. The specific tiredness of someone who had been managing a slow decline for long enough that the management had become the entire project. He was, Julien thought, a man who had finished grieving for the kingdom he had not managed to build, and had decided, somewhere in the previous decade, to concentrate entirely on not making things worse. This was not contemptible. It was, in fact, the most coherent response available to someone in his position, and Julien noted it with something approaching respect rather than assessment. The morning audience proceeded with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The king had been doing this for decades and had refined it to its essential mechanics. The opening of the session, the order of business, the recognition of speakers, the closing, with the same economy he had presumably brought to everything else that still required his attention. He did not perform authority, he exercised it, which was the more durable version. 2 of the 3 lords who actually made the council's decisions shifted in their chairs before offering their responses. Not toward each other, toward the man at the end of the table, with the specific posture of people who have learned to track one signal above all others. This happened 3 times during the first item of business, twice during the second. Julien watched it without appearing to watch it and filed what he saw. There was a node in this council, and the node was not the king. He would find the node before the session was out. When the discussion turned to the Eastern tariff schedule, a subject on which the third prince could not plausibly have views, had never had views, and was not expected to contribute, Aldous caught Julien's eye across the table with the mildest possible interrogative lift of his eyebrow. Anything. Julien had a momentary and precise awareness that this was a test of some kind, the specific shape of which he did not yet have enough context to read. He said with the mild interest of someone who had been following the conversation from a comfortable distance, "Are the seed oil prices being affected as well?" I had wondered whether the eastern crop rotation might. He paused, made a small, apologetic gesture. No, that's probably a different question entirely. One of the lesser lords suppressed something that was not quite a smile. Another looked briefly at the ceiling. The king's expression did not change by any measurable amount. The eccentric prince. The label settled over him as naturally as a coat that fit because it had been broken in by someone else. He did not have to do anything except continue wearing it. Roderick found him on day 5 in the outer courtyard, where Julien was examining a lichen growth on the north-facing wall with an expression of genuine scientific curiosity. He was, in fact, examining the lichen with genuine scientific curiosity. This was a useful quality in a cover that required him to be interested in things most people were not interested in. He was actually interested in them. The lichen was a species he didn't recognize, its distribution pattern suggesting something specific about the moisture content of the stone at this height, and he had been half composing a thought about what that implied for the structural condition of the north-facing walls generally, which was not, he admitted, entirely separate from his parallel assessment of the sight lines from the courtyard to the postern gate, which was the other thing he had been doing. 2 tasks, 1 posture. He found it economical. Roderick announced his arrival through volume rather than proximity. He was the kind of man who moved through the world as though the world had been configured to receive him, and the courtyard, which was not small, nonetheless contracted perceptibly around his entrance. He was a large person, and he used the largeness deliberately, in the way of men who had learned early that size was a form of argument and had never needed to update this model because the people they encountered most often confirmed it. He stopped near Julien, looked at the lichen with the flat assessment of a man who had no opinion about lichen and would not be developing one, and launched without preliminary into an observation about the importance of a prince being seen among his men. Julien listened. This was rarely as passive as it appeared. The lecture, for it was a lecture, structured as advice but functional as autobiography, covered several minutes of ground: the necessity of demonstrating physical readiness, the corrosive effect of prolonged convalescence on a soldier standing, the specific relationship between a commander's constitution and the morale of those beneath him. Roderick had views on all of these subjects and expressed them with the completeness of a man who had not previously been asked for them and found the asking gratifying. At the appropriate moment, well after the lecture had given him everything useful it was going to give, Julien said, "Which campaign was it that taught you that?" About the effect on morale, specifically. Not the question an idiot would ask. Too specific, too genuinely curious. Also too mild to read as a challenge, which was the delicate line. He wanted information, not a demonstration. Roderick answered with the fullness of someone who discovered, for the first time in this conversation, that he was talking to a person capable of a real question. He named a campaign on the northern frontier 3 years past. He described the command situation, the terrain, the specific incident that had clarified the principle for him. The description was detailed and coherent, and the military judgment it contained was sound. He had earned that judgment, and the experience behind it was real in a way that Julien filed without prejudice. The complete profile took approximately 3 minutes to assemble. Military experience, genuine, significant. Capacity for independent judgment in the field, above average, limited in application to scenarios that look like previous scenarios. Model of human behavior, assume the gap between what a person said and what they meant to be small. This was a limitation rather than a flaw. It was simply how Roderick had learned to read the world, and the world he operated in had largely confirmed it, because people around him generally meant approximately what they said, and found it easier to defer than to dissemble. The limitation would become structural vulnerability only in contexts where someone was doing the other thing, which he was presently doing. "That's very useful," Julien said, with the warmth of someone who had found the conversation more engaging than he expected. "I hadn't thought about the supply logistics side of it." Roderick looked gratified and slightly surprised. The combination specific to people who have not previously been thanked for their expertise by someone they had written off as incapable of receiving it. He left looking satisfied with the encounter, which was the correct outcome. Julien returned to the lichen, which was still interesting, and to the sightline problem, which he now had enough information to resolve. Aldous did not encounter him by accident. This was the first and most important thing he registered when his second brother appeared in the library doorway on day 6, with the expression of a man who had been passing by and found himself pleasantly diverted. The expression was good, natural, unhurried, carrying just the right quality of serendipitous interest. Julien had produced similar expressions professionally for 20-odd years, and recognized the effort behind this one precisely because it was so well concealed. Aldous was here because he had decided to be here. That meant he had wanted something from this conversation before the conversation began, and whatever he wanted was not what he was going to say he wanted, which was the definition of an assessment interview. Botanical taxonomy, Aldous said, settling into the chair across from him, with the ease of a man at home in libraries generally. He gestured at the volume open on Julian's knee. The Harwick survey? I didn't know it was in the collection. Too informed. A man who knew which volumes were in the Stonewatch collection and could identify them by their bindings at conversational distance had made a prior decision to know this. Aldous had prepared for this conversation. People who prepared for conversations with people they had already dismissed as harmless were not themselves dismissible. They were merely committed to appearing as though they were. Julien filed this under priority and kept his face in the register of mild pleasure at unexpected company. What followed was elegant. Julien would grant him that. The questions came wrapped in genuine interest, routed through botanical tangents and observations about the eastern mountain flora, and each one was probing a different quadrant of the same central question. What does Julien know, and what does he think about it? The court's political situation arrived through 3 different vectors. A remark about the council's agricultural committee, a question about the tariff record's completeness, a comment on the garrison's supply logistics. Each casual enough to be innocent, each too well-timed to be accidental. It was an assessment interview conducted in the register of pleasant afternoon conversation, and it was conducted by someone who was good at this. Julien gave him nothing useful. This was not difficult because he genuinely did not yet know enough to know what useful would look like, and performing knowledge he had not assembled would be a worse mistake than appearing ignorant. He answered botanical questions with botanical answers. He observed mildly that the council sessions were more technical than he had expected, which was true. He mentioned that Lord Ashworth seemed to have strong views on the garrison logistics, which was also true, and which he had gathered from the previous day's audience, and which required no more access than any other attendee had possessed. 3 data points, assembled from what Aldous chose not to say rather than what he said. His social intelligence was genuine, not cultivated for this specific purpose, but developed as a natural aptitude and then refined, the way some people had an ear for music and some people had an ear for what a room was actually doing. His ambition was present but managed, kept below the surface with the discipline of someone who had learned that visible ambition in a second prince was a liability rather than an asset. And his finances, obliquely referenced in 3 asides about recent arrangements and the usual trading accounts, were considerably more comfortable than a second prince without estates and with only an official stipend had any structural reason to be. He did not react to any of this. He described a particularly promising fungal growth he had noticed near the east postern gate and expressed a mild hope that he might identify its genus before the cold weather closed in. Aldous made his excuses within the next few minutes, pleasantly, warmly, with the naturalness of someone who had gotten what he came for and had no reason to linger. The performance remained good until the door closed behind him. Julien sat with the quiet for a moment. In a long career spent interviewing people across several of the world's more demanding institutional contexts, there had been perhaps 6 occasions on which he had come away from an initial encounter with the specific awareness of having been on someone else's assessment grid. Not suspected, assessed. The distinction mattered. Suspicion was aroused by something visible, but assessment was conducted regardless of whether anything visible existed. Aldous had been assessing him because Aldous assessed everyone, as a matter of professional habit, the way some people kept a ledger. The awareness lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then he noted it, filed it under priority, do not underestimate, and returned to the Harwick survey, which was actually interesting. The formal council session on day 8 ran 3 hours and covered the budget shortfall, 3 unresolved border disputes involving grazing rights, a petition from the Eastern Pass merchants about road maintenance, and a disagreement about the garrison's winter allocation that had been appearing on the agenda. The boys' memories suggested for the better part of 2 years without resolution. Julien sat in his corner and appeared to be absorbed by the grain of the table. What he was actually doing was considerably more precise. He was building in the systematic way he had built similar pictures in different rooms in different decades. The functional map of how power actually moved in this council, not its official map, not the map that the procedural rules implied, but the one that could be inferred from watching which bodies in the room oriented toward which other bodies before committing to a position. The result was unambiguous by the end of the first hour. Lord Brennan Ashworth spoke 3 times in that first hour. He was perhaps 60, gray-haired and thick-necked, with a specific quality of stillness in the upper body that Julien associated with people who had long since stopped needing to perform authority and were simply exercising it. Each time he spoke, before he had finished making his point, 2 other lords shifted their weight, physically, measurably, in their chairs, in the direction of what his point was going to be. Not because they agreed automatically, because they were tracking the signal above all others. Ashworth was the node. The council ran through him. The king knew this. That was visible too, in the quiet efficiency with which Edrin managed the session around Ashworth rather than against him, directing other lords first on contested points, allowing Ashworth's position to emerge late after the room had already taken its shape, so that Ashworth's conclusion appeared to be confirmation of a consensus already forming rather than the cause of it. It was a competent workaround, and it required the king to be, at all times, 1 step ahead of the sequence. He was. He had been doing it long enough to have made it automatic. The Treasury shortfall, when it came up on the 3rd agenda item, produced 40 minutes of debate that did not resolve anything. Julien followed it closely, not for the debate's conclusions. There were none, but for what the debate's structure revealed about the underlying condition. The nobles on the council extracted revenue from their territories before it reached the crown's accounts. This was not illegal under current practice. It was simply the arrangement that had been in place long enough to have hardened from an informal accommodation into a structural feature. The crown could not address it without someone being willing to do the thing that had never been done. And no one was willing because doing the thing that had never been done required authority the crown no longer had, and resources the crown had long since stopped possessing. And because the lords who would have to be confronted were exactly the lords on whose cooperation the crown depended for everything else. The king managed this with the specific exhaustion of someone who had understood this problem clearly for 20 years and had made peace with not solving it, because the cost of attempting to solve it was a civil conflict he could not afford to lose and could not guarantee to win. The management was real, it was also the ceiling. He left the session with a complete mental map of the council's power structure and said nothing in the corridor afterward, except to a passing servant, to whom he mentioned that the second-floor corridor near the council room smelled of damp, and that someone might want to have a look at the north wall. The servant thanked him and continued on his way. The prince was known for noticing things like that. The king called him to the study on the evening of day 10, without stated reason. The summons arrived through Marta in the tone of something routine, which it was not. In 10 days of court life, the king had addressed his youngest son twice in public sessions and not at all in private. The study was on the north-facing side of the castle, 2 floors above the Great Hall, a room that had the specific character of spaces actually used rather than maintained. Documents were on the desk, not set out for display but in the organized disorder of active work, covered in annotations in a hand he recognized from the council session's margin notes. The shelves held operational texts, military histories with broken spines, a tax ledger open to a middle page, maps with handwritten corrections obscuring the original print. There was no art on the walls. There was a small wooden carving on the corner of the desk. A mountain bird, he thought, though it was worn smooth enough that the specific species had become a matter of interpretation, old and handled and not decorative in any deliberate sense. The kind of object kept because discarding it had never come up. The window faced north. Of course it did. Edrin did not stand when he entered, which was either informality or exhaustion or both. He looked up from the document he was annotating and assessed his youngest son for a moment in a way that was not the way a man looked at an eccentric who required management. Julien filed this. He sat down in the indicated chair and waited. "How are you feeling?" the king asked. His voice had the quality of someone who had learned to make even procedural questions sound like they were worth asking. "Much improved," Julien said. "The fresh air has helped. The walks in the courtyard. And the slopes below the east tower. The terrain is interesting." The king considered this. He was looking not at Julien but at the window, at the particular darkness the mountains made against the sky at this hour. A darkness that was deeper and more absolute than the sky around it. The mountains present as an absence of stars. He had chosen this view deliberately at some point, or had stayed in a room that had it long enough to have made the choice implicit. "What do you find interesting about it?" He asked this to the window rather than to the room. Julien had prepared several versions of this answer. The one he gave was the simplest. The way the terrain shapes movement, which paths hold in which weather, where you can see from and where you can't. He paused. "It's not something the maps in the library capture particularly well." "No," the king said. "They don't." A silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but had something waiting in it. The quality of a room where someone has decided whether to say a thing and has not yet acted on the decision. "Your mother liked the mountains," Edrin said. He said it to the window. He did not follow it with anything. No elaboration, no context, no indication of what he meant by offering it. He simply placed it in the room the way one might set down an object to see where it landed. Then he looked back at the document on his desk and made a note in the margin. And the quality of his attention shifted back into the working register. And after a moment, he dismissed Julien with a gesture that was not quite a dismissal. The door to the study, when Julien reached it, felt like a question left open rather than a conversation concluded. He walked back through the north corridor without a particular destination, which was unusual enough that he noticed it as a deviation from standard operating procedure and did not immediately correct it. The information was not operationally useful. He turned it over once to confirm this and confirmed it. A dead woman's relationship to the landscape he was currently using as a strategic asset was not a variable he could place in any column he was currently running. The king had set it for reasons that were not available to him yet, whether as a test, an offering, a statement about what the king had already noticed, or simply the specific kind of disclosure that tired men made to people they were still making up their minds about. He stopped walking for a moment in the corridor outside the stairwell. The boy's memories had very little of her. Not suppressed, just genuinely sparse. The way childhood memories were sparse when the source of them was gone before the remembering had developed its full architecture. A presence that had weight without specific content. A voice he could approximate but not reproduce. An inclination toward the north windows that the boy had inherited without knowing where it came from. The way people inherited gestures from the dead and called them habits. He cataloged this in the column without a professional label and resumed walking. There would be a category for it eventually. There always was. He returned to his rooms and told Marta he would not need anything further tonight, which she received with the mild surprise she always showed when he made a request that ended her working day early rather than extending it. He watched her go with the awareness, not useful, simply present, that she had been genuinely relieved to see him looking better this week. This was the kind of awareness he had spent an entire career learning to register without acting on, and he was still learning it in this body, and it was still somewhat more distracting than it had any operational right to be. He sat at the window for 10 minutes. What he had at the end of day 10, the court's working map, complete enough to use. The council's power structure and its structural dysfunction, both understood clearly. 3 character profiles sufficiently assembled to act from: the king, the elder brothers, the domestic obstacle in Ashworth. An anomaly in Aldous that required attention. A confirmed cover identity, publicly validated across 7 days of court life, operating without visible strain. What he had not budgeted for, a king's offhand reference to a woman whose mountain-facing preferences, the son she had not lived to know, had apparently inherited. The specific texture of that, which was not grief exactly, since he had no claim to that particular grief, but which occupied a category he could not file efficiently and had therefore been carrying around since the king's study with nowhere obvious to put it down. He did not analyze this for long. Analysis of things without professional categories was not a skill the career had developed in him. He went to the desk instead and took the agricultural ledger from the shelf where he had placed it on day 3. He opened it to the back, to the blank pages behind the last recorded crop yield, where no one was likely to look because no one was likely to imagine that the pages were being used. He took up the pen. He had invented the shorthand in his previous life, in a different century and a different context, for the specific purpose of writing things that no one else was going to read. It was compact, irregular, and required a key that existed only in his own memory, which made it either very secure or a significant vulnerability, depending entirely on what happened to his head. He began to write. The map was beginning. The permission was trivially easy to obtain. He had expected this, in the way that one expects things already largely confirmed by the available evidence. But the ease of it was still worth noting, because the ease of a thing was itself a kind of data. Lord Brennan Ashworth, whose private opinion of the third prince had been legible in every council session Julien had attended so far, received the request for botanical excursions in the foothills below Stonewatch, with a brief silence in which he appeared to briefly consider whether the request was worth contesting, before concluding accurately that it was not. The prince wished to examine mountain lichen. This was precisely the kind of thing the prince wished to do. Lord Ashworth had 17 more important problems on his desk and wished the prince well. He did assign a guard, which was the predictable compromise between propriety and indifference. The prince should not be wandering unsupervised at 5 weeks past a serious illness, but neither was he worth assigning a competent guard. The soldier sent to the courtyard at the first bell of day 11 was young, slope-shouldered, and named, he confirmed through the introduction he had been waiting for, Pell. Pell had the look of a man who had signed up for the king's service, expecting some proportion of the work to involve a sword, and had instead spent the majority of it in the particular misery of cold corridors and administrative postings. He assessed the horse, the satchel, and the prince with the flat resignation of someone updating a running total in the column, labeled further evidence that this is not what I was promised. Julien felt a specific, useless sympathy for this, which he set aside and did not act on. Ready? He said. Pell said he was. The terrain below Stonewatch opened outward past the postern gate in a way the castle's narrow windows had not prepared him for. 3 days of observation through north-facing glass had given him proportions, but not scale. The difference between knowing the frost spine was large and standing below it on a clear morning, with nothing between himself and the range but 3 miles of descending slope and the cold, specific weight of mountain air. The peaks ran east-west in an unbroken line, and their particular quality of permanence, the sense not of height but of intention, of things that had been this way before the fortress and would be this way after it, was something he had not fully accounted for. He noted this and filed it, not because it was operationally important, but because terrain work was never purely operational, and the things that affected morale affected planning, and he did not accept himself from this. Then he began working. His method on unfamiliar ground was the same he had used on 6 previous postings across 3 decades, adjusted for the reality that this posting required him to appear to be doing something else. He moved slowly. The body still required slow movement, and the body's requirements remained more authoritative than his professional preferences. And within the slow movement, he tracked, where the slope funneled foot traffic toward natural choke points, where the sight lines narrowed and widened, which paths showed the consistent compaction of regular use versus the irregular track of intermittent passage. He looked at the ground as much as the horizon. The ground was where information actually lived. He did also examine lichen. This was not inefficiency. Pell followed at the specific distance of a man trying to be somewhere else by implication. He said nothing for the first mile, which was professional restraint, and then said something about the weather, which was the human urge to fill silence asserting itself in the absence of professional necessity. Julien responded to the weather with a comment about moisture patterns on north-facing rock faces, which led, through a logical chain that was, in retrospect, perhaps less natural than he presented it, into a comparative analysis of lichen distribution as a function of mineral content, altitude, and seasonal temperature variance. He spoke for approximately 12 minutes without interruption. Pell's silence had a different quality at the end of those 12 minutes than it had at the beginning. It was the silence of a man experiencing something in the middle register between boredom and suffering, not quite bad enough to be memorable, too consistent to tune out, the specific variety that made time feel like it was stretching in all directions simultaneously. At the 2-mile mark, Pell mentioned that there was a posting he was due to check, a southern approach, he thought, or possibly the river junction, and that if the prince wouldn't mind, he might make a broader circuit and catch up later. Julien expressed mild gratitude at not being a burden and watched Pell disappear around a slope with the specific acceleration of a man given an unexpected afternoon. He was alone. He gave it 10 minutes, walking slowly upslope in the direction Pell had not gone, while taking note of the path's surface beneath his feet. The mud was loose from the shoulder season, but held prints well, which meant it also held the evidence of recent traffic. Foot patterns, plural, different weights and intervals, on a path that appeared on no administrative chart he had been through in the library. The path was not official. The path was used. Those two facts were not in conflict. They were simply the two most important things about it. He followed it until it joined another path running west, then continued on his original course, letting the path's logic inform his mental map as the morning burned off the last of the dawn cold. By the time he turned back toward the castle in the early afternoon, he had mapped in the working approximation sufficient for field use, approximately 3 miles of terrain that the court believed he had spent the morning failing to notice. He had also collected 4 specimens of genuinely interesting moss. This required no justification. The way station appeared on day 13. It should not have appeared in the sense that his mental reconstruction of the terrain below Stonewatch had placed this particular location. A shallow stone structure built into the base of a granite outcrop 3 miles east and upslope of the postern gate, as either unused or absent. He had marked the site as an observation point worth confirming and had not expected to find it occupied. It was occupied. He registered this at the usual moment, early enough to adjust expression, too late to adjust approach, and continued forward at the same pace. The door was open. Rabbit skins hung on a cord strung between the interior walls, recently dried in the way of skins recently worth drying. A fire had been built on the stone floor and had been burning long enough to have settled into coals. The man sitting beside it was somewhere in his late 30s, possibly early 40s, with the specific weathering of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, and had long since stopped having opinions about this. He looked up when Julien came to the doorway. He did not look surprised. He looked instead like a man deciding something, and he took the time a man who was not being hurried took. "Your Highness," he said. The acknowledgement was accurate and entirely without deference, the way one acknowledges a fact about the weather. "Kale," Julien said, which he was not certain of, but which the boy's impressionistic memory of the mountain trails produced with sufficient confidence to use. He would know within the next sentence whether he was right. The man's expression shifted by a minimal amount that confirmed the name. He waited to see what came next. Julien asked about game on the eastern ridge. He had heard, he mentioned, with the mild interest of someone who found field naturalism more compelling than court politics, which was not entirely performance, that there were interesting birds in the upper approach. He was not a hunter, he clarified. He found the behavioral patterns interesting. Cale looked at him for a moment that was probably less time than it felt. Then he said there were birds, yes, and he described them, their seasonal movement, the specific shelf of rock on the third ridge that they favored in the early morning, the way their routes changed when the snow came in from the north and they shifted to the lower approaches. He described the lower approaches with the fluency of someone who moved through them regularly and considered the details too obvious to be notable. Where the eastern path went soft in the shoulder season and became impassable by late winter. where the western trail looked direct on approach, but lost 400 yards to a drainage gully invisible until you were in it? How the approach from the north along what appeared from the fortress to be a navigable ridge took twice as long as any estimate would suggest, because the ridge walked was not the ridge visible from below, and the gap between them was where you lost the time. Julien listened. He had assembled, by the time the 30 minutes elapsed, a working model of approximately 4 square miles of mountain terrain that the court's administrative records had rendered as a largely undifferentiated slope. The model was detailed, specific, and operationally useful in ways that he suspected Cale was entirely aware he would find it. He left a coin from the court kitchen stores. He had taken to pocketing several before excursions for exactly this category of use, and made no attempt to extend the encounter. He said the birds sounded worth a further look. He thanked Cale for the time. He did not look back when he left, which was both deliberate and the appropriate signal. The encounter would be whatever Cale decided to make of it. The only variable Julien could control was whether it had been, in any way, trouble. It had not. He walked back down the slope with the satisfaction of a problem slightly smaller than it had been that morning, and made the notes he needed to make during the hour before the evening meal, while they were still precise. The following week dismantled several assumptions. He had expected the mountain community to be organized in the way of communities operating outside official oversight, loosely, defensively, in the fragmented pattern of people who have learned that coordination invites attention. What he found instead, over 6 excursions in 6 days, was something considerably more interesting. The first indication was the trading post. It appeared on the administrative records as a provisioner serving mountain way station traffic, legal, registered, paying its minimal crown fees with the unvarying punctuality of an entity with no particular desire to attract scrutiny. It was in the way that many things in administrative records were precisely what they claimed to be, while also being something else: a clearinghouse. Not a criminal enterprise in any sense that required moral qualification. A practical one. The mountain people moved goods through Wingate Pass and the surrounding terrain by routes the Crown did not control, in quantities the Crown did not track, at prices the Crown was not involved in negotiating. The trading post existed at the center of this arrangement the way a customs house existed at the center of an official one, except that its ledgers were not available to anyone who might send a garrison. The man who ran it was not Cale. Whether Cale was involved in it at all, Julien had not yet established to a useful degree of certainty. The second indication was the paths. There were more of them than even his first week's assessment had suggested. He identified 7 distinct routes through terrain that the court's maps represented as impassable or irrelevant, all of them showing the evidence of regular, recent use. None of them documented. They were not secret in the sense of being hidden. A man with professional attention and 2 weeks of methodical walking could find them, as he had. They were simply not in the category of things anyone had considered worth finding, because no one who made official maps had reasons to come up here looking, and no one who used the paths had reasons to advertise their existence. He mapped them all. The third indication was the marks. He found the first one on day 15. A notch cut into the bark of a pine at a trail junction, at shoulder height, precise rather than decorative, made by a blade rather than a branch. He found 4 more over the next 3 days, at junctions at the base of outcrops, once on the underside of a water crossing stone where it would only be visible from upstream. He recognized the structural logic immediately, not because these specific marks were familiar, but because the logic was informal information networks across every culture and century. He had professional experience of produce the same category of solution, because the problem was always the same. How do you leave reliable information in a public space for a specific person without advertising to anyone else that you have done so? You put marks where the relevant people know to look, in the format the relevant people know to read, small enough that people who don't know to look don't see them. Someone was maintaining an information infrastructure in these mountains. It was not, he concluded, a sophisticated one by any standard he had professionally applied. It was functional, consistent, and invisible to people who did not already know it existed, which was the correct set of priorities for exactly this operating environment. It was also, in its current state, extremely underutilized. An information system built for managing smuggling logistics was an information system with most of its architecture already in place for managing something else. He noted this and filed it in a column that was currently labeled, "With the provisional honesty of a man who had not yet decided on a better label later." The mountain people were not hostile. That was the larger conclusion emerging from the week's assessment, and it was worth being precise about, because the available rhetoric in the court, where the phrase "the past problem" appeared in council minutes with the frequency of an unresolvable headache, had implied a community in active resistance to Crown authority. What he found instead was people in practical indifference to Crown authority, which was a different thing. Indifference was the orientation of people who had decided that the relevant institution was not part of their operating environment. It was not ideological. It was the predictable result of the Crown having never given the mountain people a reason to include it in their operating environment, except as an occasional source of conscription orders and inconsistent tariff enforcement. Hostility required defeating. Indifference required only a better offer. He had not determined yet what that offer would be. He had determined that it was not a closed question. On day 19, he extended his range. The ridge above the pass approach was an hour's walk past his usual circuit, on terrain that required both hands in two places and rewarded a year of reasonable health more than his current 5 weeks of grudging recovery. He made the climb without drama and without an audience. Pell's willingness to find other duties had by now been confirmed as structural rather than situational, available by deployment of the lichen lecture or any of 3 botanical variants he had developed in reserve, and arrived at the ridgeline as the morning cleared. He saw Wingate Pass for the first time. He had read the surveys. He had assembled from the boy's impressionistic mountain memories and from the past geography section of the Stonewatch Library's most worn volume, a working mental model of what he would find. What he had not been able to model because no administrative document he had read had thought it necessary to include was the sheer legibility of the thing from this height. The pass was not wide, perhaps 100 yards at its narrowest, a natural gate through the frostbine's spine where the rock on either side rose nearly vertical for 300 feet before leveling to ridgeline. It was the one passable point in approximately 40 miles of otherwise impassable range. He could see this clearly. He could also see clearly that it was ungoverned. He sat and watched for 2 hours. He had learned over a long career that watching something for 2 hours before forming a conclusion about it was almost always worth the 2 hours. What moved through the pass in those 2 hours? 6 loaded merchant carts. He counted the axles. The loads were covered, and he could not determine their contents from this distance, but the carts were road-worn in the way of things that made this crossing regularly. The horses settled into the specific patience of animals that had walked this approach enough times to have stopped expecting variation. A company of Iron Dominion soldiers on what appeared to be a routine rotation, 50 or 60 men marching in loose formation with the relaxed discipline of a patrol between assignments. They moved through the pass with the ease of people exercising a privilege no one had thought to contest. He marked the pace of the march in the direction. 2 independent traders on foot, carrying packs that were large relative to their bodies in the way of people who had calibrated exactly how much weight they could move at exactly this pace. A group of approximately 20 people, loosely organized, moving in the particular way of people who knew where they were going and were coordinating without needing to discuss it. Their affiliations were not legible at this distance. He filed this as the clearinghouse's traffic and moved on. No one stopped them. No one stepped out of a gate or a guard post with a registry and a fee schedule. No one asked anything of any of them. They moved through the throat of the continent's defining geographic feature in the same way that water moved through an unblocked pipe, because the passage was open and nothing was in the way. He stayed on the ridge for the second hour in the specific stillness of someone who has understood something and is waiting for the understanding to settle into the correct shape. The Treasury shortfall was not a revenue problem. He had known this from the council session on day 8, from the structural analysis of how Crown revenue was actually captured and where it stopped before reaching the accounts. But he had been thinking about it in the wrong frame. He had been thinking about it as a problem of authority, who controlled what resources, which relationships needed restructuring, which lords needed managing. This was a real problem, and he would still need to address it. It was not the primary problem. The primary problem was that the most valuable geographic asset on the continent was generating no revenue at all, not because anyone had taken it from the crown, but because the crown had never thought to charge for it. The merchants were not evading a toll. There was no toll. The pass had always been this way, a free crossing, ungoverned, an amenity of the landscape that everyone used and no one owned, because no one in the succession of Oakhaven's rulers had ever looked at it from this ridgeline and asked the obvious question. He asked it now. The obvious question was this: if you put a gate on this pass and a fee schedule at the gate and made the fee low enough that paying it was substantially more attractive than attempting the sea route or the alternate overland options, and there were no viable alternate overland options, he had confirmed this. The frost spine was the frost spine for 40 miles. What did the math produce? He did not have precise trade volume figures. He had the 2-hour sample. He estimated conservatively. The math produced a number that was considerably larger than the Treasury shortfall. He came back down the ridge in the early afternoon, moving carefully on the same terrain that had required both hands on the way up. And he was aware of the quality of his own attention during the descent in a way he was not usually aware of it. The quality was different from the quality he brought to terrain assessment, or to social mapping, or to the slow accumulation of administrative intelligence. It was the quality of a man working at a problem that has just resolved itself into a plan. The specific, practical pleasure of looking at a solution and finding it clean. He had been in this body for 19 days. He had done nothing yet. He had done nothing on purpose, because 19 days was insufficient time to understand what he was doing well enough to do it correctly. An incorrect action taken from insufficient information was the category of mistake that had ended careers he had personally observed ending. He walked back through the afternoon in the direction of Stonewatch, which was visible from 3 miles out on this terrain as a block of darker gray against the mountain's gray, built low and wide and without ornament. Someone had put it exactly here. Someone had looked at this pass, this terrain, and this approach, and had built exactly here. He had been thinking about what they understood. He had a clearer picture of it now. He took the longer route, not an efficiency, a decision, the kind made in the last hour of a productive day when the primary work was done and the additional cost was small. He had seen a junction on day 15 where 2 unmarked paths converged under a stand of old pines, and he had not had time to look at it properly, and today's terrain had brought him within reasonable range of it. The junction was a muddy confluence in the shadow of the pines, the kind of spot that invited no particular attention. 2 paths meeting at an unremarkable angle, the mud rutted from recent traffic, but not unusual in that. He looked at it anyway, with the particular attention he brought to things that unremarkable people had regularly chosen to pass through. The mark was on the largest pine, at the height of a standing adult who had not bothered to look around before making it, which was itself informative. Someone comfortable here, familiar with who did and did not pass this way. It was cut into the bark rather than scratched, which implied a blade rather than a hand, which implied intention. The mark itself was simple, 2 lines crossing at an angle with a notch at the left arm. He had seen this specific symbol, or something functionally equivalent to it, in 3 previous operating contexts across his prior life. The exact form was irrelevant. The structural content was not. The symbol meant this junction is monitored and the information received here is current. The notch at the left arm meant the current cycle's last transmission had been received and acknowledged. Someone maintained this mark. Someone checked it on a schedule. Someone had built in this mountain terrain above an ungoverned pass the skeleton of an information relay. He committed the symbol to memory with the precision it deserved and did not touch it. The intelligence value of a network you were watching was always higher than the intelligence value of a network you had revealed yourself to. He had found the door. The hand on the other side of it was not yet visible, and the visibility was more useful than the door. He walked the remaining mile to Stonewatch in the blue light of early evening, which had a specific quality this latitude produced in the last hour, before the peaks ate the sun. Flatter and colder than the south-facing light of other climates, as though the light itself had adapted to the same economy that had built the fortress without ornament. Not unpleasant. simply clear. He told Marta he had had a good day. She received this with the particular warmth of someone who had been measuring his color and his gait since the postern gate, and had already formed her own opinion about the quality of the day. "You should eat something substantial," she said, in the tone that was not a suggestion. He agreed that he should. He ate. He went to the desk and opened the agricultural ledger to the blank pages at the back. The shorthand was already becoming natural in this body's hand, which was a different hand from the one he had used for 30 years, with different calluses in different places and a slightly different weight distribution across the fingers. The writing it produced was somewhat less precise than he preferred. He was adapting. He added 3 items to the current map. The first was the pass observation, the traffic volume, the military rotation, the clearinghouse's movement patterns, the complete absence of any toll infrastructure. He wrote it in 3 lines. The second was the path network, the 7 confirmed routes, their seasonal reliability, their relationship to the trading post, and to the probable locations of the clearinghouse's transit cycle. He drew a small diagram in the margin, roughly to scale. The third was the mark at the junction, reproduced precisely with a notation about its structural meaning and a question, whose? He had no answer yet. The answer was available. It simply required more time and better position, and both were obtainable. He closed the ledger and placed it where he always placed it, in the specific position that would indicate disturbance if the position changed. Outside the window, the frost spine was dark against the last of the sky. He did not stand at the window for long. He had seen it from the ridge today at sufficient length for professional purposes, and standing at windows in the dark was not, on reflection, a useful expenditure of time. He went to bed. This was still not the same thing as going to sleep. The most important work of the week was done before he left the castle, and it left no mark anyone could see. He had a name now, or rather he had the shape of a name, and was reasonably confident the shape would resolve into one. The mark on the pine had told him that someone organized information in these mountains. The next question, the only useful next question, was who, and the court's administrative records answered it the way administrative records always answered questions, which was incompletely, indirectly, and to no one who was not willing to read them as a continuous text rather than a series of unrelated entries. Julien was willing. It was, in fact, one of the few activities available to a convalescent prince that required nothing of the body and everything of the part of him that had survived the transfer intact. He requested the customs ledgers under the pretext of an interest in the regional flora's commercial uses, a pretext so consistent with his established character that the clerk who retrieved them did not trouble to wonder why a man interested in moss wanted 20 years of tariff records. The clerk brought them and left him alone with them, which was the entire point of having built the cover in the first place. He read them as a single document spanning 2 decades. The picture assembled slowly in the way that pictures assembled from administrative records always did, not as revelation, but as accumulation, each entry meaningless on its own and meaningful only in the company of the others. There was a customs notation that recurred on one particular eastern route with a regularity that suggested either a very honest smuggler or a very specific arrangement. There was an absence, a category of evidence Julien had learned to read as carefully as any presence, of prosecutions, despite enough documented activity to justify a dozen of them. Goods moved. Goods were recorded as moving. No one was ever charged with moving them. This was not the pattern of a community successfully hiding from the crown. It was the pattern of a community the crown had quietly agreed not to look at too closely, which was a different arrangement entirely and implied someone on the mountainside competent enough to have negotiated it. And there were the petitions. This was the entry that resolved the shape into something nearly a name. Over 20 years, the mountain traders had submitted a thin but steady stream of petitions to the court for road maintenance, for tariff adjustments, for relief from grain requisition in bad winters. The petitions were uniformly ignored, which was unremarkable. What was remarkable to a man reading 20 years of them in an afternoon was that they were written in the same hand. The signatures changed. 5 different men had put their names to these documents across 2 decades. The handwriting did not change at all. Someone literate had been drafting the mountain community's correspondence with the crown for 20 years. Someone consistent enough to do it the same way every time, and sufficiently positioned to speak for multiple clans without any of them apparently objecting to a single person holding the pen. In Julien's experience, which was extensive on precisely this point, the person who held the pen for a community that distrusted writing was almost always the person who actually held the community. He had a hand. He did not yet have a face. But Cale's incidental references, the way certain decisions in the Eastern Territory were described in the passive voice, things that were arranged and settled and worked out, with no agent ever named, pointed toward the same node the petitions did, and a node that two independent sources pointed toward was a node worth the walk. The name, when the boy's impressionistic memory of mountain talk finally surrendered it, was Brask, Harlan Brask. He spent the second day on the other half of the preparation, which was harder because it required him to know something he could not simply read. He needed to know what Harlan Brask wanted. Not in money. He could have guessed the money, and the guess would have been useless, because a man who had spent 20 years building an arrangement with the crown that involved the crown not noticing him was not a man who could be bought with the crown's coin, even setting aside that Julien had none. The question was not what Brask could be paid. The question was what Brask actually needed and could not get. The thing that, if Julien could eventually provide it, would make the relationship worth more to Brask than its risks. He worked it out from the petitions, because the petitions were a 20-year record of asking, and a record of asking was a record of wanting. Three things recurred. The first was legal standing for the paths, the unofficial routes the mountain community had used for generations, and that existed, from the crown's perspective, in a gray space between tolerated and illegal, which meant they could be declared illegal at any moment by anyone who found it convenient. The second was exemption, formal and reliable rather than occasional and arbitrary, from the grain requisition orders the crown imposed in bad harvest years. Orders that fell hardest on exactly the people least able to absorb them. The third was harder to name because the petitions only circled it. A recognition that the mountain people were not a problem the crown tolerated, but a service the crown received for free. They moved the goods. They kept the routes open. They had been doing the work of a custom system for a kingdom that had never built one, and they had been doing it without thanks, without status, and under intermittent threat of being treated as criminals for it. None of this was Julien's to give. He had no authority to legalize a path or exempt a village or recognize anything on the crown's behalf. He was the third prince, the spare part, a man whose requests Lord Ashworth granted because refusing them was more effort than they were worth. But knowing what a man wanted was a different kind of holding than being able to give it. It was the more durable kind. A man who could give you what you wanted owned the transaction. A man who knew what you wanted and was willing to wait until he could provide it owned something slower and considerably harder to walk away from. He intended to spend that knowledge carefully, which meant, for now, not spending it at all. The meeting, when he arranged it, was arranged to look like the absence of arrangement. This was the part of the work that the court would have found least comprehensible and that Julien found most familiar. He extended his botanical range eastward toward the margin of the territory the clearinghouse used as its main transit zone, close enough to be in Brask's world, not so close as to constitute a visit. He chose the time from what he had, the carved marks location logic, which implied a transit cycle. Cale's offhand mentions of when the eastern routes ran, the simple discipline of a man who had staged a great many encounters and knew that the trick was never to make the staging good enough to be invisible, because invisible staging looked like luck, and a professional did not believe in luck. The trick was to make the staging good enough that the other party would recognize it as staging and respect the competence of it. Harlan Brask recognized it immediately. He came down the path without hurry and stopped at a conversational distance and looked at Julien for a moment with the flat, complete attention of a man taking inventory. He was older than the record had suggested. Mid-50s, barrel-chested, gray through the beard, with the particular economy of movement that Julien associated with people who had spent decades in places where an unnecessary motion was a risk you did not take twice. He held himself the way the genuinely dangerous held themselves, which was to say without any visible interest in appearing dangerous. He did not pretend the encounter was chance. He looked at the satchel and the specimen knife and the careful position Julien had chosen with its clean sightline down the path, and he arrived at his conclusion with the speed of a man who had been arriving at this category of conclusion his entire life. Princes don't come to the mountain trails, he said, unless they want something. No, Julien agreed. They generally don't. What followed was an examination, and both of them knew it was an examination, and the knowing did not make it less rigorous. Harlan administered it the way a careful man administered anything, without hurry, without warmth, and without any of the social lubricant that might have let Julien slide a wrong answer past on the strength of charm. He had clearly been burned before by people offering things that sounded too useful to refuse, and he had clearly resolved at some point in the 20 years the petitions documented never to be burned the same way again. His questions were the questions of a man who had decided that the only protection against a good liar was specificity, because a good liar could match your tone, but could not match facts he did not have. He asked about the legal standing of the Eastern Path. Julien told him what the records showed, that the path had never been formally recognized and never formally prohibited, that it survived in the gray space of crown inattention, and that this was a vulnerability rather than a freedom, because what had never been granted could never be relied upon. Harlan's expression did not change, which Julien read as the answer being correct. He asked about the grain requisition 3 winters past, a specific year, a specific order, the kind of detail a court insider would have no reason to retain. Julien gave him the figure, the villages it had fallen on, and the fact that the requisition had been quietly under-collected by a third because the officer responsible had understood, correctly, that collecting it in full would have killed people the crown could not afford to be seen killing. This last was not in the records, it was inference. And Julien presented it as inference, because presenting inference as fact was exactly the kind of error a careful man tested for. Harlan let a moment pass. And the officer's name? Not in the ledgers, Julien said. I'd be guessing. I don't guess at names with men who'd know if I got it wrong. It was the first answer that produced a reaction. Not approval, nothing so generous, but a small recalibration, the look of a man moving a counter from one column to another. The court insider would have produced a name to seem informed. Julien had declined to, because declining was true, and Harlan was a man for whom the willingness to say, I don't know, was worth more than any individual fact. You've done your reading, Harlan said. I have time, Julien said. It's the one thing my position comes with. Harlan looked at him a while longer. Then he asked the question the whole examination had been built to reach, in the same flat tone he had used for all the others, which was its own kind of test, because the question deserved emphasis, and he was watching to see whether Julien supplied the emphasis for him. And what do you want, he said, for knowing all that? Julien had thought about this answer for 2 days, which was the correct amount of time to think about the single most important sentence in a recruitment. The wrong answers were numerous, and he had discarded them all. He could have named a thing he wanted, and Harlan would have weighed it and named a price, and the relationship would have been a transaction, bounded and finite and forgettable. He could have offered money he did not have. He could have implied a threat, which would have been both untrue and the fastest way to end the conversation, because a man like Harlan did not respond to threats by complying. He responded to threats by disappearing and taking his network with him. What he said instead was the truth, which had the advantage of being both true and, in this specific case, the most effective available move. Right now, he said, only to be useful to you, and for you to remember, when I eventually ask you to return the favor, that I was useful first. Harlan did not answer immediately. This was not the answer he had been prepared for, and Julien watched him not be prepared for it. Watched the small effort of a man revising an assessment he had thought was nearly complete. People who wanted something said what they wanted. That was the rule Harlan had built his caution around, and Julien had just declined to follow it, which meant Harlan's caution did not have a slot for him yet, which was exactly the position Julien had wanted to put him in. That's not how it usually goes, Harlan said. No, Julien said. I know. He had brought one thing to give, and he gave it on the fourth day, when they met again at a place Harlan had named, a different way station, higher up, with two exits and a sight line that Harlan had clearly chosen for both. Julien noted the choice and approved of it, and said nothing about it, because a man who pointed out that he understood your precautions was a man telling you your precautions had failed. The thing he gave was a name. There was a customs official, he told Harlan, who had been enforcing the Eastern tariff selectively, not failing to enforce it, which would have been ordinary corruption, but enforcing it precisely against three of the clans and not the others, in a pattern that looked like incompetence and was actually an arrangement. The officer was being paid by two merchant families to make the eastern route unreliable for their competitors, and the three clans bearing the cost of it had almost certainly attributed their troubles to bad luck and inconsistent crown policy, because the alternative explanation required them to know something they had no way of knowing. Julien knew it because the records showed it once you read the records as a continuous text, and because a single carefully unremarkable conversation with a court clerk had supplied the connecting fact the records omitted. He had engineered the conversation to look like idle curiosity. It had taken 4 minutes, and the clerk did not remember having had it. He gave Harlan the name, the families, and the pattern. He attached no condition to it. "What do you want for this?" Harlan said, and it was not the same question as before, because this time he already suspected the answer. "Nothing," Julien said. "This one's free." It was the most important sentence he would say all week, and he said it the way he said everything, which was mildly, as though it were obvious. The point was not the name, valuable as the name was. The point was the restraint, the deliberate, legible decision not to extract maximum value from a piece of intelligence at the moment of maximum leverage. Every experienced operator understood the signal, because every experienced operator had learned to read it. A man who does not press his advantage when he holds it is a man thinking about a longer game than the one in front of you, and a man thinking about a longer game is either a fool or someone worth taking seriously. Harlan Brask had not survived 20 years by being a fool, and he did not mistake Julien for one. He sat with the name for a moment. Then he nodded. Once minimal, the acknowledgement of a man who did not perform his reactions because performing them had never once kept him alive. They did not shake hands. There was nothing to shake hands over. Harlan committed to nothing except a second meeting, 10 days out, at a place he would choose and disclose closer to the time, which was the correct level of commitment for where they were, and Julien accepted it as such without letting any eagerness show. The meeting was the agreement. Both of them understood that the meeting was the agreement, and so neither of them said so, because saying so would have been the kind of overstatement that careful men noticed and held against you. 10 days, Harlan said. "I'll be in the mountains anyway," Julien said. "I find them interesting." Harlan looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, and was the nearest thing to one the meeting had produced. "I'm told you find the moss interesting." "I do, actually," Julien said. "That's the part everyone gets wrong." He ran the conversation against the template on the walk back, which took the better part of 2 hours and gave him exactly enough time to do it properly. The template was old, and he had used it in enough context that running it was nearly automatic. What did the other party reveal? What did they withhold? And what did the shape of their withholding tell you that their revealing did not? Harlan had revealed competence, caution, and a long memory. He had withheld, completely and deliberately, any indication of what he had concluded, which was itself the most useful thing he had revealed, because a man who let you see his conclusions was a man who had not learned to hide them, and Harlan had clearly learned. He was more careful than most people Julien had recruited in a career largely spent recruiting careful people. He was also, which was both rarer and more promising, skeptical in a way that read as professional rather than personal. This was the distinction that mattered, and Julien turned it over until he was sure of it. Harlan was not suspicious of Julien because he disliked Julien, or distrusted princes, or resented the crown, though he might have done all three, and Julien would not have blamed him for any of them. Harlan was skeptical of the arrangement, of any arrangement, because he had been burned before and had built his entire operating posture around not being burned again. That meant the obstacle was not Julien's identity or Julien's manner or anything Julien could not change. The obstacle was that reliability had not yet been demonstrated, and reliability could only be demonstrated over time, by being reliable, repeatedly, when it would have been easy or profitable not to be. Julien had demonstrated capability. That had been the work of the week, and it had gone as well as it could have gone. But capability and reliability were different currencies, and a man like Harlan would not confuse them, and the second one could not be bought or argued or accelerated. It could only be accrued. So he would accrue it. He had time. He had said so to Harlan, and it had been true, and it remained the one genuine advantage his position conferred. Everyone who had written him off had handed him the same gift without knowing they were handing him anything. The years that no one thought to guard, because no one believed he would do anything with them. He began on the walk back to spend them. He reached Stonewatch in the last gray of the afternoon and went up to his rooms and told Marta the day had agreed with him, which it had, and which she had already concluded from his color before he said it. He waited until she had gone before he opened the ledger. The blank pages at the back had begun to fill, slowly in the shorthand the boy had never known. He found the current page and added a line. Brask, possible. Patience required. Supply, patience. He looked at it for a moment. It was accurate but incomplete, and the incompleteness was the part worth recording, because the part worth recording was always the part that had surprised him. And Harlan Brask had surprised him slightly, which almost no one in this court had managed to do. He added a second line. Also, he is better at this than most people I have dealt with. Note for the file. Then he closed the ledger and set it in the position that would tell him if it had been moved, and he went to bed, which remained a separate and considerably more disciplined activity than going to sleep. Harlan named the place 2 days before the meeting, through a route Julien did not see and could not have traced if he had tried, which was the first piece of information the second meeting produced and arrived before the meeting itself. The place was a cave system above the tree line on the eastern approach, an hour's hard climb past the last point Pell had ever been willing to follow him. Julien went up early. He had learned a long time ago that the way you arrived at a meeting was itself a message, and that the message was read whether or not you intended to send one, so it was generally better to send one on purpose. He read the location as he climbed toward it, the way he read everything, and what it told him was that Harlan Brask had chosen it the way a professional chose a location, which was to say for reasons that had nothing to do with comfort. The mouth of the cave gave a clean line of sight down the main trail for what Julien estimated at 400 yards, far enough to see a man coming with time to decide what to do about him. There were 2 exits. He confirmed the second one before he settled in to wait, not because he intended to use it, but because a man who had not located the exits was a man who had not been paying attention, and he wanted to have been paying attention. Whoever had chosen this place had been thinking about surveillance and escape at the same moment, as 2 halves of a single problem. That was not the thinking of a smuggler worried about the weather. It was the thinking of someone who had been hunted or had hunted and had learned the geometry either way. He arrived early, and he did not hide that he had arrived early, because hiding it would have implied he thought arriving early was something to be ashamed of, and he wanted Harlan to understand that he had nothing to hide about how carefully he did this. The honesty was tactical. Most honesty worth deploying was. Harlan came up the trail at the appointed hour, and he did not come alone. The second figure was a young woman, and Julien revised 3 assumptions about the meeting in the time it took her to come into focus at the 400-yard mark, because she did not move the way someone moved who had come along to carry something. She moved the way someone moved who had come along to watch. Harlan stopped at the cave mouth, and the woman did not. She continued past without instruction, without a glance exchange that Julien could detect, and began a circuit of the surrounding terrain that was unhurried and complete and entirely professional. She checked the sightlines. She checked the second exit. Found it, Julien noted, in under a minute, which had taken him 3. She checked the slope above the cave where a person could lie unseen, and the stand of rock below it where 2 people could. And she did all of this with the specific economy of someone for whom it was not an occasion, but a habit. Harlan offered no introduction beyond the functional minimum. She checks these things, he said, which was a sentence carrying considerably more information than its 6 words, and Julien received all of it and showed none of the receiving. He did not comment on the sweep. He did not watch it openly, which would have been a discourtesy, nor ignore it entirely, which would have been a lie. He watched it the way one watched competent work being done in a shared space, with the corner of the attention, and he filed what he saw under a heading he did not yet have a name for, in the same unlabeled column where Marta had gone. And the king's remark about the mountains and the other things that did not fit the system but declined to go away. She finished. She took up a position near the second exit, slightly behind Harlan and angled to see the trail, and she did not sit down. Julien understood that he was not going to be introduced further, and that this was correct, and that asking would have been the kind of mistake that ended the relationship he had spent the previous week not making mistakes to build. The meeting itself was shorter than the first, which Julien read as the best news the day had offered. Length in these conversations was a function of uncertainty. The first meeting had been long because Harlan had needed to take the full measure of a stranger, and taking the full measure of a stranger took time. The brevity of the second meant Harlan had already done most of his deciding, and was here not to decide but to confirm. A man did not climb above the tree line with his most careful person to confirm a no. You delivered a no by not coming. Harlan had verified the customs intelligence. He said so plainly in the flat register Julien had come to recognize as the man's resting state and to prefer over the alternatives. The name had been accurate. The pattern had been accurate. He had checked it through means he did not describe and Julien did not ask about, and it had held, which meant the thing Julien had given him for free had turned out to be exactly as valuable as Julien had quietly known it was, and exactly as freely given. So, Harlan said, regular conversations? He did not say arrangement. He did not say alliance or agreement or any of the words that would have committed more than he was willing to commit. He said regular conversations, which promised nothing except more of this, and which was, precisely because it promised nothing, the largest thing he could have offered. Regular conversations, Julien agreed, using the same words, because adopting a careful man's chosen language was a way of telling him you had understood why he chose it. That was the whole of the agreement. It took less than a quarter of an hour. The woman by the exit watched the trail the entire time and said nothing, and when they left she went first and Julien did not see which way she went after the first bend, which he suspected was the point. The 6 days that followed were the most productive Julien had spent since he woke in this body, and the least visible. He went into the mountains every day the weather allowed, and several it did not. Some days Harlan came, or sent someone, never the woman again. Other people, men mostly, who guided without conversation and watched Julien with the reserved attention of people extending a stranger exactly as much trust as their elder had authorized and not a margin more. Most days Julien went alone, on the routes Harlan had now confirmed, and did the work that he had been doing in fragments since the first excursion, and could now, finally, do as a whole. He completed the map. It was not a map in any sense a court cartographer would have recognized, which was the point, because the court cartographers had been making maps of this terrain for a century, and had produced documents that were accurate about where the rocks were, and useless about everything that mattered. What Julien built was a picture of the pass as a system. The physical geography was the least of it, the skeleton on which the useful information hung. Over the skeleton he layered the things the court maps omitted because the court had never thought to ask. Which routes held in which weather and which dissolved into impassable mud or snow? The informal precedents of right-of-way that the mountain traffic obeyed without anyone enforcing them. The timing patterns that meant the merchant carts moved at certain hours, and the clearinghouse's people at others, and the two categories almost never met, by an arrangement no document recorded because no document needed to, since everyone who needed to know it already did. And he located the choke points. There were three places in the whole geography of the approaches where the terrain funneled movement so completely that a small number of people positioned correctly could observe a very large number of movements without being observed in return. He had suspected the existence of such points from the beginning, because such points always existed. Terrain that funneled armies also funneled information, and the two were the same problem viewed at different scales. Finding the specific three was the work of the week, and finding them was worth the week because the man who controlled the choke points controlled what could be known about everything that passed through them. One of the three was already occupied. He came to it on the fifth day, a narrow ridge approach about 2 miles north of the pass throat, where the trail bent around a shoulder of rock in a way that opened, for anyone standing in the right place, a view of nearly the entire northern approach. He had marked it on his mental map as a position to confirm. When he reached it, he found it confirmed in a manner he had not anticipated, which was that someone was already using it. The signs were subtle, and he might have missed them a month ago, before he had learned to read this particular landscape. A place worn slightly smoother than the rock around it, where a body had sat more than once. A sightline kept clear of the small encroaching growth that should have softened it by now. A second carved mark, cousin to the one on the pine at the junction, cut into the underside of an overhang, where it would catch the eye of someone lying in exactly the position the worn rock implied, and nowhere else. One of Harlan's people was using this ridge as an observation post. Had been, from the where, for some time. The network already possessed, in embryo, unformalized, maintained by instinct rather than doctrine, precisely the forward observation position that a professional intelligence service would have spent months and considerable resource establishing. Julien sat in the worn place for a few minutes in the specific stillness of a man recalibrating an estimate upward. He had been thinking of himself as someone who would build a network out of raw material. He revised the thought. He was not building from nothing. He was formalizing something that already half existed, that had grown up over decades around the practical needs of people who moved goods through dangerous country, and that contained in scattered and unconscious form most of the structural features he would otherwise have had to invent. The mountain community had been running an intelligence operation for 2 generations without ever calling it that, because they had never needed to call it anything. It had simply been how you stayed alive up here. He did not improve the position. He did not leave a mark of his own. He noted it and committed it and climbed down the way he had come and was careful to disturb nothing because the position was not his yet, and a man who rearranged another man's furniture had told that man exactly how little he understood about whose house he was in. The intelligence arrived on the 8th day, and it arrived sideways, which was how the most important intelligence usually arrived. Harlan had come out that morning to look at a route, ostensibly, though Julien had begun to suspect that Harlan's reasons for coming were increasingly the conversation rather than the route. They walked a stretch of the northern trail, and Harlan, in the middle of describing something else entirely, mentioned in passing that the patrols had changed. Julien did not stop walking. Which patrols? Dominion. Harlan said it the way a man mentioned weather he had no particular feeling about. Their rotations on the north side used to run on a pattern you could set a clock by. Same intervals, 30 years. You could plan a crossing around them in your sleep. 3 weeks back, they stopped being so regular. Not gone. Just, he made a small gesture, a man reaching for a word that was not quite there. Looking more. Same number of men. More often where you wouldn't expect them. Like somebody told them to pay attention and didn't say to what. It was, from Harlan's side, context. He was offering it the way you offered a stranger a piece of local knowledge, as the texture of the place, rather than as anything he thought Julien would weigh. He had no reason to think otherwise. The Iron Dominion's patrol habits were, to a man who moved goods through these mountains, a logistical nuisance and an occasional danger, not a strategic indicator. Harlan did not have the frame that would make them into one. Julien did. He had spent a previous life learning to read exactly this kind of signal. The small, consistent change in a routine that meant the thinking behind the routine had changed, and the frame snapped into place around Harlan's offhand sentence with a speed he was careful not to let reach his face. He asked 2 questions. He asked them mildly, in the register of a man whose curiosity was general rather than acute, because the surest way to teach Harlan that this information was valuable was to react as though it were. And a man who knew he held something valuable charged more for it, or grew careful about parting with it, and Julien wanted neither. He asked whether the change was on the north side only, or both. North only, Harlan thought. He asked whether anyone had a guess about the cause. Harlan shrugged. The mountain consensus, to the extent there was one, was that the Dominion did inexplicable things periodically, and you waited them out. Probably nothing, Julien agreed, and changed the subject to the route they had ostensibly come to see. He ran it on the walk back, alone in the long cold light of the early evening. He set Harlan's observation against the things he knew about the Iron Dominion, which were not many but were structural, and structural facts were the ones that held weight. The Dominion was food insecure, and had been for as long as anyone's records ran. Poor land, a conscript economy, a chronic gap between what it could grow and what it needed to eat. It had a military culture organized around the conviction that what you could not grow, you took, and it had spent 30 years regarding Wingate Pass and the lands beyond it as a thing that ought to belong to it and did not, with the particular resentment of the hungry looking at a door they had decided was theirs by right and barred by other men's convenience. For 30 years, that resentment had stayed resentment, because resentment was cheap and action was expensive, and the Dominion had always had a more immediate problem somewhere else. The patrols had run their clockwork rounds and the carts had crossed between them, and nothing had changed, because nothing changing was the natural state of a standoff that suited no one and that no one had the surplus to disturb. And now, 3 weeks ago, someone on the north side of the frost spine had begun looking harder at a past they had been ignoring for 3 decades. It was not alarming. He was careful to keep it from becoming alarming in his own assessment, because a professional who let a single thread frighten him made bad decisions about which threads to pull. It was not nothing either. A change in observation was the cheapest possible precursor to a change in intention. The thing a military did first, before it did anything that cost more, because looking was free, and looking was how you found out whether the more expensive things were worth doing. Someone was finding out. Someone in the Dominion's military was looking at Wingate Pass with the specific quality of attention that a man brought to a thing he was thinking about using, rather than a thing he was content to trade through. He did not have enough to know who, or why, or whether the looking would become anything. He had a single observation, secondhand, from a source who did not know what he had handed over. It was a thread and nothing more, and the discipline that had kept him alive in 2 lives now required him to treat it as exactly that, to note it, to position himself to learn more, and to refuse the temptation to build a conclusion on a foundation that could not yet bear one. But it was the first piece of intelligence about the world beyond Oakhaven that had come to him rather than the reverse. He had not gone looking for it. It had flowed toward him through a channel he had spent 3 weeks building and arrived in his hands as a matter of course. That was the whole architecture of what he was trying to make, expressed in a single second-hand sentence about another country's patrols. Not to be the man who went and found things out, but to be the still point toward which the things that were found out came home. The architecture was working. That was the news of the week, larger than the Dominion and quieter. He had built a thing, and the thing had begun to function as designed, and it had done so before he was anywhere near ready to need it, which was precisely when one wanted such things to begin functioning, while the stakes of their failure were still low. He reached Stonewatch after dark and ate what Marta had kept for him and told her the mountains had been generous, which she took to mean the air had done him good, which was true in its way and not the way he meant. He waited for the household to settle. Then he opened the ledger. He turned past the pages on the pass and the paths and the choke points, past the line about Brask and the line about the woman who checked things, to a clean page, and at the head of it he wrote a single word in the private hand. Dominion. Under it he wrote 2 questions, and he did not write any answers, because he did not have any, and writing answers he did not have was the one form of dishonesty his system did not permit, since it was dishonesty aimed at himself. Why now? Why look harder at a thing they have ignored for 30 years? He underlined the first question once. Then he sat looking at it for longer than he had intended to, in the lamplight, in a stone room 3 floors up, in a kingdom that did not know it was standing next to a question this size, and he felt the specific discomfort that he had learned to recognize as the most reliable signal his profession produced. The restlessness of a man who has found a problem he cannot yet address at the scale it deserves. He needed more people, in more places, watching more things, and rooting what they saw back to this room. He had the beginning of that now. He did not have nearly enough of it. The distance between the network he had and the network this question demanded was the distance he would spend the rest of the season trying to close. And he understood, looking at the underlying words, that the season had just acquired a reason to hurry that it had not had that morning. He closed the ledger and set it in its place and did not stand at the window, because there was nothing at the window the dark had not already taken, and went to bed, where he lay for some time doing the only thing the hour permitted, which was thinking and was not the same as rest. Harlan raised her at the third meeting, and the way he raised her was the first thing worth noticing about her. He did not describe her as an asset. He did not describe her as a recruit or a contact or any of the words that implied a person could be acquired. He described her the way men describe someone who was indispensable and could not be managed, which were two qualities that did not usually sit together, and were, in Julien's experience, the exact combination that produced the most valuable people and the most difficult ones. "There's someone runs the information side," Harlan said. They were sitting in a different place again. Harlan never met twice in the same location, a discipline Julien had stopped noting, because noting a constant was a waste of attention. The relationships, who's moving, who's talking, who owes what to who, the marks on the trees that you found, and don't tell me you didn't find them. You've been walking past them slow enough. He let that sit a moment. "That's hers, the whole of it. She built it." "Not your system," Julien said. "Hers. Mine keeps goods alive. Hers keeps people alive. Different trade." Harlan looked at him with the flat directness that Julien had come to understand was the man's version of candor. "I'm telling you because of what I think you're doing. And if I'm right about what you're doing, she'll have it worked out inside a week. She's probably halfway there now." He paused. "You'd want to get to her before she gets to a conclusion on her own. Conclusions she reaches by herself, she keeps. Conclusions you bring her, she argues with. You'll do better in an argument." It was, Julien thought, one of the most useful things anyone had said to him since he woke in this body. It was a warning dressed as a referral, and the warning was the gift. He filed it whole. "Does she have a name?" he said. "Or do I find that out as the first test?" "Wren," Harlan said. "Ashcombe. And no, the test'll be something else. She doesn't repeat herself." He spent the next day building her before he met her, which was the discipline and which the day rewarded. He had the administrative records which held her family the way they held everything in the mountains. At one remove, sideways, more in the gaps than the entries. Ashcombe. Aldrich Ashcombe was the formal head of the clan, a name that appeared on 3 of the 20 years of petitions, and was, Julien now understood, one of the 5 signatures over the single hand. The hand had never been Aldrich's. The daughter ran most of what the father decided, and the father, by every indication Julien could assemble, knew it and preferred it that way, which told Julien something useful about both of them. She was 23. She had been schooled, properly schooled, by a merchant clan master in the market town below the pass, in a community where literacy was distributed unevenly enough that a person who had it fully was a person who could speak for people who did not, which was the origin of the single hand in the 20 years of letters. She had been offered 2 marriages by other clan leaders, both advantageous, both declined. In the mountain community, where a clan alliance by marriage was the ordinary currency of security, declining one good match was an eccentricity. Declining 2 was a position. She had decided that her value to her people was higher unmarried and unattached than spent on a single alliance, and she had been proven right long enough that no one offered a third. That was the shape of her. He turned to the harder question, which was what she wanted, because what a person wanted was the only door a recruitment ever walked through. And a person like this would not want any of the obvious things. He worked it out, or worked out enough of it to begin, and what he arrived at made him set down the assessment for a moment and reconsider the whole approach. She did not want what the rest of the mountain community wanted from the crown. Legal status, requisition relief, recognition. Those were Harlan's wants, the wants of men who moved goods and needed the moving made safe. Her want was larger and considerably harder to satisfy, because it was not a thing the crown could grant. She wanted the mountain community's way of being to survive whatever came next. She had watched the court ignore the mountains for the whole of her life, and she had concluded, correctly, Julien thought, with the specific discomfort of a man recognizing his own analysis in someone who had reached it without his advantages, that indifference was the most survivable relationship her people had ever had with power. Interest was the danger. Any change in how the crown regarded the mountains could go two ways, and princes, in her experience, pushed things the way that suited princes. It was a legitimate concern. It was, in fact, exactly the concern Julien would have had in her position, which was the problem, because the most difficult thing to overcome in any recruitment was not hostility or greed or fear, but a correct analysis of one's own interest. You could argue a man out of a mistake. You could not argue a person out of being right. He noted his own respect for the concern, and then noted, separately and with professional honesty, that respecting it did not make it easier to get around. The two facts lived in different columns. He let them. He went to the Ashcombe trading post on the 13th day, as himself. This was a decision, and he made it deliberately, against the habit of a lifetime. Every instinct he had refined across 30 years told him to engineer the meeting, to arrive sideways, to give the encounter the texture of chance. He overrode all of it. A staged meeting was a message, and the message a staged meeting would send to Wren Ashcombe was that he thought he could stage a meeting with her without her noticing, which would be both false and insulting, and being caught at it, and he would be caught at it, would end the conversation before it started. So he arrived as the prince, openly in a way she could not possibly mistake for accident, because the only honest thing he had to offer a woman who read staging the way other people read weather was the absence of it. The trading post was a low stone building with a wide door and the particular busy order of a place that moved more than it appeared to. She was behind a plank counter doing something with a tally stick and a ledger of her own, and she looked up when his shadow crossed the door, and she did not look surprised, and he understood in that first half second that Harlan had been generous in his estimate. She was not halfway to her conclusion. She had arrived at it some time ago and had been waiting, with the patience of a person who knew that waiting was free, to see what he would do with the fact. She was not what the records had drawn. The records had drawn a position. The person was smaller than the position and quicker, with the kind of stillness in the face that meant the speed was all happening behind it, and eyes that finished assessing him roughly 2 seconds after he came through the door and then kept watching anyway, to see whether he was worth a third look. "You've been mapping us," she said. Not a question, not hostile. An observation set down on the counter between them, like the tally stick, for them both to look at. "Yes," Julien said. "Something like that." "Not something like, you have." She set the stick down. "The eastern paths, the choke at the north shoulder. You sat on the ridge above the pass for 2 hours on the 19th of last month and watched the Dominion patrol go through, and you counted the carts by their axles." She tilted her head a fraction. "A man looking at moss doesn't count axles." "No," he agreed, "he doesn't." "So?" The word closed a door and opened another. "Now you want something." "Yes." "Good," she said, and it was the first thing she had said that he had not expected. "I was starting to think you'd pretend you didn't." She had known him for a month, which he did not yet understand, and the not understanding was the most interesting thing about him. She had watched the eccentric prince since the second day of his excursions, because watching people who came into the mountains was the whole of her work, and she had assumed for about a week that he was what the court said he was. A sick boy let out to wander, harmless, briefly diverting. Then she had walked one of his routes after him and seen where he had stopped and what he had stopped at, and the assumption had not survived the afternoon. Botanists stopped at plants. This one stopped at sightlines. He had paused at the 3 exact places she would have paused if she were choosing where to put a watcher, and he had paused at them in the right order, the order you'd walk them if you already understood that they were a system and were only confirming the spacing. She had been the one in the cave, the one who checked the exits, because she had wanted to see him up close before he saw her, and she had found the second exit faster than he had, and watched him notice that she had, and watched him decide not to say anything about it. That last part was what she had carried home and turned over. A small man would have made a remark to show he'd seen. A vain one would have raced her to it. He had simply moved her up his estimate and kept his face empty, and a person who did that was a person who had done this before, many times in places that mattered, and that did not fit a sickly boy of 17 at all. So she had been waiting, and now he was here as himself, having refused to pretend the meeting was chance, which meant he had understood that she would see through the pretense and had respected her enough not to try it. That too did not fit. She kept her face as empty as his and decided to make him work. The conversation that followed was the fastest he had had since waking, and he was aware within 10 minutes that he was enjoying it more than was strictly professional. She fired questions like a person testing a rope by pulling on it, not listening to the answers so much as watching where the answers went, reading the shape of what he chose to say against the shape of what he left out, which was the way he himself read people, and which almost no one he had met in this century did. She asked what he thought the past was worth. She asked who else he had talked to, and did not believe his deflection, and let him see that she did not believe it, and moved on anyway because the deflection itself was data. She asked what he thought would happen to the mountain clans if the crown ever got organized, and she asked it as a trap, and he declined to step in it. And she noted the declining with a flicker that was almost approval and was definitely not agreement. He gave her less than he had given Harlan, and she got more out of it, because she was working with the gaps, and the gaps were where the truth lived. He found that he had to think faster than he had planned to. He found to his mild and well-concealed surprise that he did not mind. "You're not going to tell me what you want today," she said eventually. It was not a complaint. "No, because you haven't decided how much of it to say." "Because I haven't finished listening," he said, "and saying it before I finished would mean saying the wrong version." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Come back. I'll be here. I'm always here." And then, as he turned to go, with the first edge of something that might have been humor, "Bring the moss. The cover's terrible, but I'd hate for you to drop it on my account." The pitch took 3 days. And it took 3 days not because he was slow, but because the pitch had to be calibrated. And calibration meant letting her talk until she handed him the exact shape of the thing she was protecting. She handed it to him on the 3rd day, in a conversation that began as an argument about the crown's history with the clans and stopped being an argument somewhere in the middle without either of them deciding to stop. She had thought about this more than anyone he had met on either side of the castle walls. She did not fear a strong Oakhaven because she feared strength. She feared a strong Oakhaven because she had thought through what a kingdom did when it stopped being poor. And she had concluded that the mountains, which survived now precisely because no one wanted them, would become something everyone wanted the moment the past became worth fighting over, and that a community that had survived 2 centuries by being beneath notice had no defenses at all against being noticed. "Whoever finally puts a gate on that pass," she said, "owns the mountains. And the day someone owns the mountains is the day we stop being a people and start being a labor supply." I've watched it happen to clans further south. It doesn't look like conquest. It looks like opportunity, right up until there's nothing left that's yours. It was, point for point, the analysis Julien had been building toward from the other direction. He could have told her so. He did not, because telling her so would have sounded like flattery, and she would have heard it as flattery. And flattery was the one currency she had no use for. So he made the pitch, when he made it, in the only register she would accept, which was the register of a man saying a true thing because it was true. "What I'm trying to build," he said, "doesn't work if the mountains become a labor supply. I need them to stay a distinct thing, something with its own standing relationship to the crown, not a population the crown administers. And I need that not because I'm generous. I need it because the only asset I actually have is what your people know about this terrain. And that knowledge isn't a resource I can dig out and stockpile. It lives in people, and it stays valuable only as long as those people stay who they are. The moment I dissolve the mountains into Oakhaven, I've destroyed the thing I was trying to use. So the relationship I'm proposing has to be a partnership, or it doesn't function. Not because I'm kind, because the arithmetic only works the one way. He meant it. He was aware, even as he said it, that there would come a day when he could not honor it, that the arithmetic that made partnership necessary now might, under enough pressure, point somewhere worse, and that he was the kind of man who followed arithmetic. But he meant it in this conversation, completely, and she had spent her whole life reading people for exactly that distinction, and she read it accurately. "How long is the trial?" she said. "Until you decide otherwise." She was quiet a moment. "That's either the most honest offer anyone's made me," she said, "or the most practiced. I genuinely can't tell which." "It can be both," Julien said. The flicker again. Not approval, recognition. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it can." She gave him her answer on the 20th day, and she gave it as a set of conditions, which was the only form in which a person like her ever gave a yes. A trial, then, skeptical, provisional, and entirely on her terms, which she laid out the way a person laid out a contract they had already decided not to be cheated on. First, nothing involving her, personally, went into motion without her saying so. Not used, not deployed, not arranged around. She would decide what of herself the arrangement got to spend. Second, Harlan stayed the door between her and the crown. The prince did not reach her through other people, did not send instructions down a chain, did not build the kind of structure where she woke up one day taking orders she hadn't agreed to from someone she'd never met. Harlan or no one. Third, and she watched his face when she said this one, because this one was the real one. If she ever concluded that the arrangement was being turned against the mountains instead of toward them, she walked. No notice, no obligation, no debt, and she took what she knew with her. He marked the third condition most carefully because the third condition was the expensive one. It was a permanent hole in his operational security, a standing right of exit for a person who would, within months, know more about his network than almost anyone alive. Any intelligence officer in his old life would have refused it on principle and would have been right to, by the logic of that profession. And refusing it was impossible, because refusing it would have proven that everything he had just said about partnership was a recruitment script, and she would have known. And the knowing would have cost him not just her, but the thing her presence vouched for. The condition was a test built so that the only way to pass it was to mean it. He had built tests like that himself. He recognized the architecture and admired it, and walked straight into it, because walking into it was the answer. "Yes," he said, "to all three." She looked at him for a moment longer, taking a final reading he could feel and could not interpret. Then she nodded once and picked the tally stick back up, which he understood to mean that the meeting was over and that he had, provisionally, and against her better instincts, been let in. He walked back to Stonewatch in the long light and ran the conversation against the template, the way he had run every conversation that mattered for 30 years. And the template gave him its answers, and the answers were good. She would be the most valuable person in the network. She would also be the least controllable, by her own design, which she had made him agree to in writing without paper. He had recruited difficult people before. He had recruited people he respected before. He could not, turning it over honestly in the cold air, remember the last time a recruitment had felt like this, like meeting someone rather than acquiring them, like the specific and disorienting pleasure of being, for an hour at a time, not the fastest mind in the room. He noted the feeling, because noting was the discipline, and the discipline did not get to take days off for inconvenient data. He gave it a clean entry in the part of himself where the unlabeled column lived. Next to Marta, next to the king's remark about the mountains, in the growing file of things that did not serve the work and refused to be filed as nothing. Then he set it down, because he was not, this evening, going to do anything about it. And a thing you were not going to act on was a thing best left where it lay. He sat at the writing table that night for the better part of 20 minutes. The ledger was open. The pen was ready. There was a great deal he could have recorded. The conditions, the assessment, the operational shape of what the network had just become, with Ren Ashcombe provisionally inside it. All of it belonged in the file. All of it would go in eventually. He did not write any of it. He sat and he looked at the blank page in the lamplight, and after a while he closed the ledger without having made a mark and set it in its place. And that was, for him, a particular kind of statement. The only kind he was prepared to make tonight, in a hand even he could not have read. About a day he did not yet know how to file.